Bueno, buenas tardes. Perdonen ustedes.
Good afternoon. Sorry for the slight delay for the start of the session. And it's not due to us being tired, but because we want to walk and get to see Santander. And now we will be speaking about the EU and the economic consequences of war. And the speaker today is Mr. Jonas Fernandez Alvarez. Jonas is an MEP. He is in his second term. He's member of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs of the European Parliament, and in fact is the coordinator for the European Socialist Party in this committee. We've known each other for a few years now, but I would like to say that Jonas is an economist. He's from Oviedo. He studied at the ES Business School. He's worked in a lawyer's firm. He's been a businessman. And if you will allow me, Jonas, because of how I appreciate you, I have always thought you contributed to the political world a business dimension that we should not forget about. So this is a part of the keys of the successes of Jonas in the European Parliament. The session is in Spanish and English with simultaneous interpreting, and you have the floor.
Gracias, Josep, por la invitación.
First of all, thank you, Giuseppe, for inviting me. And thank you, Cristina, and thanks to all of you for being with us this afternoon at the end of August, where we started to see that some people have probably left because it's almost the end of the course. So thank you so much for being here, even though it's a sunny afternoon in Santander and there are other very appealing destinations in Santander. So thank you for staying here. When I saw the program, I was a bit fearful when I saw that I had an hour and a half for this session in the European Parliament. They allow us to speak a maximum of 2 to 3 minutes. The High Representative has to suffer this when he speaks in Strasbourg. And having so much time is a challenge because we're used to being very brief and to summarize, but I will try not to bore you all this afternoon. So let's get started.
Consecuencias económicas
Maybe before speaking about the consequences, the economic consequences of the war, it's good to look back into the situation of February 2022. These last years,
la economía, y no solo la economía,
the economy has suffered different significant shocks and crises, which demanded from the European leaders a response capacity that was difficult to foresee in a previous crisis, even if we look back to the crisis that was almost a decade ago. At the time, the response of the European Community authorities was different. Therefore, maybe now it would be simpler to put in place more transcendent measures. And it was in February 22 when the European economy was recovering from a recession. We faced some of the risks coming from the war, like inflation. But of course, it makes sense to go over this 12 to 18 months before the war that were also important to see the response to the war, in some cases complicating things even more. If I'm not wrong, in winter of 2020, in March, is when the decision is made to paralyze our societies to stop the propagation of the pandemic. And beyond the health effects, we thought that the stop of trade and of the economy, of the local economies, of our daily purchases, could have an impact on the European economy that could bring us to the worst scenarios that had been avoided in the financial crisis. Even when in a war situation, as we see nowadays in Europe and especially in Ukraine, management of the economy becomes more difficult. The Western world and the world in general had never gone through a period of 2-3 months with minimizing of social interactions and ordinary economic activity. In a war, it is very difficult to develop activities, or those sectors that are further away from the front continue to be up and running, obviously with restrictions, and there's a reorientation of the production sector, but the European economy continued up and running during the Second World War, of course with clear restrictions and with a reorientation of the services and products provided and manufactured, of course with changes and with an effect. But Europe and nowhere else, no modern society had ever thought that there would be an almost absolute stop of financial activity. This meant high risks. Risks from possible effects, from the desperation of thousands of companies and jobs, problems in the single market, severe problems in international trade and in European trade, and an increase of the debt and the liability of homes and companies that could make disappear great part of our business fabric. But this situation was avoided, as you know. There was a recession, a drop in productivity, but the economic policy response, and I'm not going to talk about the health response, which I also believe was a success, but the economic policy to maintain the income and therefore to avoid the destruction of industrial fabric worked reasonably well. And as you know, first of all, they decided to stop fiscal norms or some by issuing public debt. The European Central Bank, that for more than a decade had implemented broadening policies or expansion policies to encourage inflation, and I will go back to this, but we should remember that Europe for more than a decade had inflations that were a bit over 1%, and now we are discussing this, and I will go back to this issue later on. So the ECB tried to put in place these measures to facilitate the flow of credit and for the financial sector not to be substantially affected by the stop in activity. The EU also put in place a program for debt issuance known as SURE that was used to fund mostly the programs where Spain received almost 20 million euros, and the investment European Bank also put in place a program to purchase grantees, in our case with the ICO, to avoid the closing of companies. And that summer in July, the joint issuance of debt was approved to provide funding not through liquidity and credit like with SURE or other similar programs that were put in place in 2011, 2012, but to transfer them directly to the states through subsidies. Therefore, there was a broader margin regarding what could be done fiscally, and with the tax and monetary regulation coming from Europe, we could maintain a situation and avoid scenarios that were during the first months of the pandemic thought would be coming and that were terrifying, and I'm not exaggerating at all. And in fact, we were able to overcome these uncertainties, and Europe was also strengthened because of a very well-received response that was, as I was saying, well-received in many of the member states. In any case, all economic policies, and I was talking about the health sector with a doctor friend the other day, and we talk about the parallelisms between the health sector and the economy. And of course, it has its own side effects. Some of these measures had side effects, some negative and other positive, that were present to the start of the war. Public debt was significantly increased in all states and in the EU. Those that are against this should have asked themselves what would have been the other situation without this issuance of debt, because this would have be a cyclic crisis, but a break with the path of growth that we had in Europe. Also, savings were created during that time, because remember, we almost couldn't consume. Consumption was limited, and we also confront monetary broadening to be able to facilitate the up and running of the financial system and to avoid problems there and in the real economy. But this monetary broadening came after a decade of active expansions by the ECB to fight against deflation, and this would have an effect on inflation later on, as we will be seeing. And these are not the side effects anymore, but we also had international trade that was still trying to recover, because there was a disorganization of global logistics, and there was a blockage in the transport. One of the causes mentioned at the time to explain the increase in inflation throughout those months, and also the quick response to the pandemic of Western societies also meant that there was a demand in wealthy countries, but in a great part of the globe, in Asia, for example, they still had severe problems because of the pandemic. So there was this unbalance between the supply and demand that was in the foundations of that inflationist trend. So in January, there was a high inflation. Energy prices had started to grow since the summer of 2021. And at that point in time, we saw underlying reasons that were derived from the pandemic, the post-pandemic, and the policies that had been put in place throughout the pandemic, and problems with trade, imbalances between supplier countries and the countries where the demand is found, and other effects derived, and we were aware of how different security decisions from Russia were also having an effect, even though we weren't aware of what they were preparing. The invasion and the start of the invasion at the end of February somehow strengthened the problems we had at the time, mainly inflation. As you know, energy prices started to hike. The prices of energy start going up, but also the war in Ukraine meant that there was a tension in food prices, and amongst between food prices and energy prices. Last summer we had inflations that in some European countries had two figures. The sanctions and not trading with Russia, trying to find alternative suppliers that would be more expensive than the previous Russian suppliers, would also complicate things with inflation, and those states that had more relationship with Russia, more trade relationship, mainly Eastern countries and countries that had shared a border with them, started to have inflations of even up to 20% in some cases. The increase of inflation rapidly reduced real wages. We didn't perceive, or there wasn't an effect of inflation on salaries, even when the labor markets were recovering quite well from the pandemic. So a great part of the inflation was heightened after the start of the war, and this ended in the profit and loss of businesses that started to see how their income didn't increase. There had been a reduction also of the power of the labor unions, and there was an increase in some of the benefits that generated a debate in Europe.
Del comercio internacional.
The way in which we worked in international trade faced more problems, and the reorientation of the monetary policy started to create uncertainties on the evolution of credit. While the deficit and debt accumulated throughout the pandemic, also, well, it is true that not at a relevant level, but they started to limit the margin for movement, even though there was a stability agreement which allowed us to be prudent, but the fiscal deficits started to be smaller in most European states.
Del año pasado.
So since summer last year, we foresaw a scenario for the winter that we've gone through that wasn't as horrible as we could imagine in February 2020, when the economy was stopped due to the pandemic, but sufficiently negative to know that we would go through a harsh winter.
No existió, no.
But finally, it never happened. And the fact that this harsh winter didn't happen doesn't mean that problems have disappeared and that they cannot reappear in the future. So in summer last year, most Eastern European economies, and especially those more exposed to Russia, registered severe problems in their trade. Also inflation problems, and the evolution foresaw, and the dependency of the Russian energy fundamentally in Central and Eastern Europe meant that we would face severe problems in the industrial sector in Europe, and more specifically in Germany. Germany, that had gone through a long period with a few deep reforms and with an economic model based on exports It had benefited from the monetary policies of the decade that maintained the exchange rate that was depreciated, and this affected other countries, but this would be a different discussion. So they had an economy mostly based on international trade, with an industrial sector with medium and big-sized companies that had two big assets. On the one hand, financial conditions that were quite favorable. As you know, in Germany, most of the financial sector is made up by savings banks that transfer great part of their benefits to the industrial sector. And on the other hand, with energy prices that were quite reduced, which was mainly used for an economy where international trade was the most significant asset. But the markets were worsening. We had the sanctions, the war, and there were other political discussions at the time too, and I will go back to this at the end of my presentation. But this meant that there was an industrial sector that depended on the energy prices, and a sector that couldn't get any benefits. The winter was expected to be very difficult, and the European Central Bank started to also raise interest rates. They started to do it at a slow pace, and then started to do it in a faster manner. And we will see up to what point. So that summer, we thought that we would be at a recession by the beginning of 2023 with high inflation. Some governments, like the Spanish government, put in place complementary measures in the electric market and in others to try and reduce inflation, but not all member states did so, which made the running of the monetary policy even more complex. And the pace expected to reduce or soften the fiscal stimulus that had been present throughout the pandemic went back to knock on the door of the budget and to put in place compensation policies for some prices, mainly energy prices and food prices. In any case, the negative view of that, or for that winter, never happened. Were different reasons for this. I was in Washington at the time, and I think Tang said that it was thanks to luck. Luck, if we take into account that the winter wasn't too cold, but also there was a diversification of supply, and the High Representative knows all of this very well to try and accelerate the trying to not be dependent on Russia at the time. So lots of products were purchased, as well as sanctions put in place. So we had a high level of storage of some energy assets. We had a winter that wasn't as harsh as expected, and energy consumption was also significantly reduced through different measures put in place by some of the states' measures. What is the situation nowadays after avoiding a recession last winter? We find ourselves in a situation that we could say is slightly better than a few months back, but with uncertainties still present. The first uncertainty is the evolution of the war. So I don't have much to say about this throughout this week. You've had the opportunity of discussing the evolution of the conflict, but it reminds me to that debate, even though it's a different kind of debate, but when we discuss amongst economists or politicians that work on the economy sphere and how during the pandemic we talked about what were the expectations for the next months. And I always say it, until we don't know the real evolution of the pandemic, if we're going to have treatment against COVID, if we're going to have a vaccine in 12 or 18 months, we, as those working on economic policy, are always behind what scientists and health practitioners say. And in this case, we find ourselves in exactly the same situation with no knowledge nor certainty. And with different scenarios before us, we really don't know what the evolution of the war is going to be, and therefore it is difficult to have a clear vision of what we will face in the next 18 to 24 months. But if the war more or less remains in the same situation as now, and I don't know if this is the situation or not, the High Representative can probably say if this is so or not, but if this could become a chronic situation after the operations from Ukraine throughout the spring and summer that haven't radically changed the scenario on the field. But this situation is the way in which we see now things as economists. And when we foresee and look at the expectations of a recession in the US, also linked to the war, they are set in between a 20 to a 50%, depending on the agency that is looking into this. And this is another issue, but there could be US elections next year with the US economy in recession. We hope it's not so. We also have the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act from the American administration that has an impact on the European economy. What we can see about this act from the Biden administration is that we need to welcome that the American administration puts in place ambitious measures against climate change, but some of these measures select the suppliers without respecting their transatlantic partners. The Chinese economy, as you know, is going through problems in real estate, construction, and the Russian-Chinese situation is difficult to follow. And there are significant risks that this Chinese deflation ends in a different kind of situation, but maybe not. We've had an increase of energy prices derived from the last OPEC agreements, and the deglobalization that starts with COVID, and going back to globalization, because during some months there are difficulties to be global, has also become a policy. Somehow, the supply problems of basic goods and services throughout the pandemic and since the start of the war in Ukraine have recovered the perception of risk, and problems have been observed by international markets regarding supply. The policies put in place to fight climate change also bring us to a strengthening of local industrial policies, and Therefore, we should not hide the side effects like the strengthening of the industrial policy that can have an effect on the inflation, probably. And secondly, and we talked about this this morning, on the evolution of security and defense problems globally. We as Europeans know that trade reduces the probability of war conflicts, and this is one of the reasons why the founding fathers created the EU, and the regional globalization, or however we want to call it, we hope strikes the adequate balance. This is not something simple to do, to be able to avoid isolation paths for some economies, societies, or important countries with whom we should maintain some kind of a trade relationship, even if it's only for political reasons. And all of this, of course, in my view. And this means that we will be maintaining prices maybe at higher levels than expected. And I'm going to go back to what I was saying about monetary policy. Of course, we each have our own view, but I wouldn't wish nor expect the European Central Bank to limit things more. This spring, we saw some of the effects of the monetary restrictions in the American financial sector, with an impact on Europe, not in the EU, but for example in Switzerland, as you know. And the expectations for inflation for the next year from the Commission and the International Monetary Fund is in around a 3% with no additional measures. This means that in the second part of 2024, we should have inflation so over a 2%, but not substantially over a 2%, if the average is going to be at 2.8, as the European Commission says, and as the European Central Bank also reviewed its strategic framework for monetary policy, and bringing the objective to a 2% on the middle term. I've already asked to the president of the ECB, what does midterm mean? Is it 12 or 18 months? But then we will be at around a 2% or a bit more. And all of this derived from the transition and strengthening of the industrial policy, and with a fragmentation of international trade, and also taking into account the high liabilities that have been issued in debt in the last 3-4 years because of the pandemic and the war, and also bearing in mind that in the last decade we had inflations between a 0 to a 1%, and sometimes negative or no deflation. So I believe that if we maintain these expectations, we will have inflations in around 2.5 to 3% during some time. In any case, I believe I'm a minority in this debate in Brussels regarding this issue.
Tax policy. There'll be tax rules in 2024. We can talk about them in the debate afterwards. The ideas that are on the table include a certain amount of flexibilization of regulations for national budgets. Labour markets in Europe are still working well. The actual problems that we'd accumulated after the pandemic and before the war will have been recovered from the next year to 18 months. Funding and loan conditions will still be restricted because of current monetary policies. There may be additional restrictions, but we'll see. And accumulated savings in recent years have almost been paid back. The economic scenario in Europe for the next 12 to 18 months shows there's a certain risk of recession, especially if the German economy gets deeper into the recession it's already in, where there are underlying structural debates. It's rather that it's not a cyclical question. There are problems in the underlying problems in the German economy that need to be reviewed, and in the other economies of the Eurozone, depending upon how restrictive tax policies are and how restrictive monetary policy is, we may end up in a moderate growth phase. It's said that this year the European economy will grow by just over 1%. The outlook for 2024 about 1.6, 1.8% growth. But of course there are also risks out there, many uncertainties. Principally from the way the war goes, but also because of cyclical and structural questions, both the stepping up of the fight against climate change, the need to make greater supply security for some production chains, the fragmentation of international trade in Germany mainly, but in the Eurozone as well, which is very much overseas facing, create sufficient uncertainties for us to be cautious. I hope not to have bored you for too much. It's Thursday afternoon, I do realize that.
Yo creo que a pesar de lo arduo que
I think despite how difficult technical explanations are for those of us that aren't economists, what can be said about Jonas is that he's very clear in the way he explains. We may agree with him or not, but he is clear in his explanation. Let's start the debate. Let's start. I'm going to start from the front and go backwards. Anybody else? This lady here, and then Senator Uribe. Firstly, thanks for spending some time with us this afternoon. An interesting talk. Jonas, I wanted to ask you about the impact of youngsters in the EU's economy, especially when you consider that youngsters make up 16% of the current population. Are there any policies being implemented? For example, if you're young and you want to leave home, that's really difficult in cities such as Madrid and other large cities, which are expensive. Why are there no plans to make this easier? Of course, this is also influenced by birth rates. My name is Pamela Varela, and I direct Copra Mundo. Senator Uribe, good afternoon. Thank you, Jonas, for your talk. Yes, I'm a PNV senator. For me, you were a little too optimistic regarding the ECB's attitude towards rates increases. If I pull apart what you've said, I understand that you feel that it's got as far as it's going to go. And I have my real doubts about that, and I'll say why. It's because Europeans' economic and monetary policy is inspired historically by what happens in Germany. And Germany, and that includes the EU treaty, and I'm sure Fonseca could tell us more about that. These are the only two constitutional texts where it's explicitly mentioned that one of its goals is the fight against inflation. We've got figures from the third quarter in Germany. It shows that they're not positive. They're still in a recession, and they've got 6.5% inflation, more or less. So I feel, and of course this is an opinion, but maybe you can say something about that, the ECB, inspired by the historic monetary policy, which is the driving force of the European economy, it's not that it doesn't worry, but that rather it is more concerned about the fight against inflation than economic growth, i.e. inflation, fighting inflation is a priority, and if that entails an inflation, or if we get stagflation, then what's actually a priority for the ECB is the fight against inflation. Secondly, China's economic problems. As you said, Germany is an export-based economy. Can you make some comments about the new European economic governance, the reduction of deficit and debt, and whether you feel that in the next months before the end of this year, will the new economic growth stability pact be approved, and governance for the European economy, which is very similar to the Next Generation programme and MMR. One third question, Antonio García Riego. He's a Spanish member of the European Economic and Social Council. He looks like a good guy, but actually used to be a banker. Thanks, Paco. I have to add that Paco and I went to school together many years ago in Valladolid, although he, as you can see, is a lot older than I am. Thank you, Jonas. It's a pleasure to see you here talking about this subject. And thanks, Paco, to chair this afternoon. A couple of comments. Firstly, you spoke about many future variables and many scenarios that, of course, will have a notable impact in what happens in the future, and that includes what happens with the war and how that affects economic situation in Europe. The other one is that you didn't mention is the American economy and the fact that there are elections in the States next year. And I know this is a complicated matter to talk about, but I think it's really important to highlight the impact that a Republican victory, more specifically a Trump victory, could have on the future of the war. My second comment, and it's linked to what the Senator said earlier, the Stability Pact and the return to the European kind of regulated path, and your comments about the need to embark upon structural changes beyond the cyclical ones that need to be dealt with. There are structural challenges that need to be dealt with. I was reading this week's The Economist that there was a need for the German economy to carry out structural changes to its approach. But that's not just Germany that has to do that. Germany is the driving force of the European economy, But it's also important to think about this because there are many other European countries also need to deal with structural issues. And amongst the things that I read is, for example, the need to reduce bureaucracy. Setting up a company in Germany requires 180 days of bureaucracy. And now they're actually paying the price of short-sightedness in the past when interest rates were almost zero. There are so many delays when, for giving example, licenses to become an entrepreneur, the tax systems which entrepreneurs are subject to. One of the reasons why there are no unicorns in Europe is because they go to the US to get capital. You know that better than anybody else. The need to finish the capital markets union. What I'm saying with that is that Germany needs to face structural changes, Europe as well, and many other member states as well. And I'll finish by saying it's important to know that in any European legislative proposal, and you know that in the European Parliament, they have a responsibility. So let's remember competitiveness. Is what we're doing now really helping Europe become more competitive? That's my final point. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias en primer lugar.
Thanks. Pamela. The program that I referred to earlier. One, and that funds this event includes Next Generation funds. The name of the fund is intentional. It's not just a matter of mobilize money, but also mobilize money to deal with a cyclical situation during the pandemic. And also the idea is to use these additional monies from the community's budget to assist the modernization of our economies and provide new opportunities for the current and future generations, new generations. When you think what the European Union does, I think we all recognize the EU has a role in education, not just via Erasmus and Erasmus Plus and other programs that are aimed at education. And of course, at youngsters, there are also programs to encourage mobility, programs for research, where a large part of the research teams are PhD students. But when you look at the powers or the remit for local and regional councils, in fact, even at a micro level, they could facilitate these transitions. In fact, these things are more in the hands of a state level, a national level, rather than an EU level. But the EU, of course, has present in its debates on the future of Europe for the new generations, and they are always in the public debate in the European Parliament. Senator Uribe, regarding monetary policy, maybe what I initially said, I spent more time what I thought should be done rather than what is going to be done, which isn't something that's within my pay grade. Without any additional information to what I'm going to say, we're seeing how China's in deflation. Prices to producers are also going down. And we haven't seen whether salaries are tracking inflation or not. In fact, there's room, and the salary agreements that were signed between trade unions and employers' organisations a few months ago, with increases in salaries of above 2%, have or shouldn't contribute to inflation, because there was sufficient wiggle room retained last year when salaries didn't increase in line with inflation. So there is sufficient actually room to increase salaries above inflation. And I say, with the current inflation outlook, and when for 2024 it's being looked at around 2.7, 2.8%, and with recession risks in the American economy as well as the European economy, how we got through the risks of last winter, even accepting that national authorities and EU authorities have got it right in energy policy. Even though somebody said at the end of July we were lucky with a not so cold winter, we were to a certain extent late. We don't have the same fears as this year as we had last year, but we're taking sufficient precautions to, in my opinion, not limit monetary policy any further at the moment. That's my opinion, as I said at the beginning, but maybe I didn't spend enough time talking about what I think the ECB is going to do. But I hope they take notice of these arguments. We shall see. It may well take notice of other arguments. But the probability of the German economy entering into recession, and the ECB, when it carries out its strategic reviews, and the most recent one was a year and a half, they're not, the treaties are not linked to price stability, but it's the ECB that defines what that actually means. In the most recent review, it says that inflation should be around 2% in the medium term. It's true that in 2023 we've had, and 2022 we had very high double-digit inflation levels in many states. Over this year, they've been reduced, and if forecast for the next 12 to 18 months is around 2.8%, I think there's sufficient room to not have to restrict monetary policy further, but we'll see what happens. As for economic governance, the rules won't be ready by the end of the year. It's impossible. What we hope is that the Council and the Spanish presidency is able to get some kind of commitment amongst member states before the end of the year. And in our side, in the Parliament, because we co-legislate on that, we're hoping to strike an agreement at the Economics Committee by November, December. So it would be in the first part of December under Belgian presidency when negotiations between Parliament and Council would be undertaken, and this should be closed by the end of April, beginning of May, because Parliament stops and ordinary legislative work wouldn't restart until after the summer, and states need rules to be able to prepare their budgets. As for the Commission's proposals and the ideas that are on the table, they all require a certain amount of flexibilization. Well, flexibilization can be greater or less depending upon the proposal. My opinion is, and I'm talking as an MEP What I'm really concerned about is rule revision. It's part of my work, actually. But I'm more concerned about negotiation about own resources that are going to be used to reduce the debt. So they're going to amortize debt, but there aren't resources to amortize that debt. In fact, this wasn't a problem for the market so far. In fact, the market even bought these issues of debt were being bought when they're at negative interest rate, but they need to be amortized. And there's a proposal of own resources from the EU to amortize that debt. Some have been amortized, but they've still not been passed. From a federalist viewpoint, Europe still requires a fiscal tool. It was created as a one-off thing to face up to the pandemic, but it still needs to be put up and set up to go for dealing with the debt. Hamilton, for example, taxed whiskey imports to pay debt. We've issued mutualized or shared debt. We've decided to put a tax on imported coal, but that still won't be enough. And when we talk about future crises, when we need to manage cycles, I think it's more important to finally defend this pillar, define this pillar, which will defend tax rules in the States. But if the European pillar is well defined, if debt has only been issued for a specific moment, this income source should be permanent, recurring, so that this debt that's being issued is a stock variable in the future. You can't have a collateral with recurring incomes. And its conditions, the debate on the state's fiscal rules. So if in the future crisis, if we know there's a community tool that can help us manage this cycle, which is what happened, even if it was only a one-off during the pandemic, then the maneuver margin for national budgets can be more or less respective depending upon the strength of this community tool. There are legislative proposals by the Commission on the table. The Spanish presidency will have to deal with that and take it to the Council. And we need to do things as well. As for American policy, it's just all uncertainty. We had several sessions with the political analysts, and apart from the debate on the situation of American politics, and the truth of the matter is, and I'm taking this debate over to my field now, let's see to what extent the American economy goes into recession or not. Goldman Sachs was more optimistic, said a 20% possibility of recession in the next 12 months, but there were some that were forecasting greater than 50% forecast, and this would put us in a scenario for an election scenario next summer, very different. Inflation has generated an important political problem in Europe. It will be more so in the States. It's making the continuation of the Biden administration increasingly difficult. And if we're in a recession, the situation will be even worse. We're hoping that that doesn't happen because, as I said, if Trump returns, things are probably even worse. Not just in Ukraine, but in general. As for the need to assess the competitiveness, as you said, Antonio, there's something that makes Europe unique, and negatively unique, which we don't refer to on many occasions because we want to increase our competitiveness, or when people start debating the increase in the union, which is the problems with consolidating the single market. We know that there have been problems in the banking market and in the financial market. There's still some national barriers, major national barriers. It's very segmented, and all services industries are still facing tariff barriers within the European Union single market. In fact, the growth potential of the European Union, if we are able to accelerate the reduction of national barriers and accelerate the single market, are incredible. And these barriers don't exist in the US. The US is a consolidated economy. It has a single market. There are national barriers as well, but they're not like ours. And their room for improvement is far smaller than ours. If we managed to do away with many of these barriers, we would gain tremendously in competitiveness without having to reduce taxes very much, because there would be sufficient margin to generate growth without debating about whether taxes should be at 20 or 21%, which could also be debated because you can get the same resources if you grow enough with lower taxes, with lower taxation levels. Thank you. Guillaume, just wait a minute. I'm the chairperson. However, my role as chair also means that I have to intervene in the debate. You said something key about the EU's financing capacity, its funding capacity, the idea of maintaining with recurrent income expansion. It may well be that you don't know this, but the EU and EU funding was 1% of total GDP. We budgeted that at around €1 billion for 2021 to 2027. With Next Generation, the miracle happened, and we've gone from €1 billion to 1.8 billion. That's almost 2% of GDP.
But as Jonas said, the markets haven't had problems, but the debt is there. So we should remember that a big challenge, and I know that in the EU Parliament you agree with this, a challenge when looking into the markets, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe this instrument maybe should become a permanent one or not, or with what guarantees, because in that case we duplicate the amounts, and I'm not an economist, but this believes there are enough guarantees to be able to do so. And what am I saying this? And that my question has to do with this, because in Next Generation we have half of the subsidies that will be paid back by the EU from here to 2050. The next half that will start next year are loans, and the EU goes to the market and then provides these loans, and the states have to pay back this through their national accounts, if I'm not wrong. And I hope you're following what I'm saying. So we start with 700 million, then we start with the first issuances, and correct me, but the interest rate at the time was 0.15%, and the last are almost in a 2%. Ergo, I could be tempted with this financial uncertainty for states not wanting to use this money that they will have to pay back. And this is so we wouldn't comply with the objectives of the next generation. And secondly, there's less trust in the market. So my question is, do you believe economic uncertainty can go against the next generation funds? And sorry, I had to say this. The issuance of debt for next generation has been thought of to become a federal community debt, but it can end up being Eurobonds. It is thought of as a community level debt because it's issued together and paid back with resources from the EEC. We don't have the resources to pay it back, then it will be the states that have to pay it back. And if it's the states, then there is a joint issuance and everyone pays back their own part. And that would be bonds. With next generation, we've gone beyond the discussion of Eurobonds and we've gone a step further because we have a joint debt and we will be paying it off together too. The first issuances happened when the interest rates were low. And sometimes we had issuances in our country and in Germany where these rates were negative. Now issuances are more expensive, but states and in our case, Spain, that will demand the credits that they didn't demand or get in the first round because Italy did so, but Spain decided to first start with the subsidies and leave the credits for the second stage. But in general terms, the credits that can be supplied to states by the Commission will be cheaper than going directly to the markets. So even if there is an increase in interest rate, the interest rate paid by Europe in relative terms is lower than the interest rates paid in most countries. Therefore, it continues to be profitable to use these credits. But it is true the markets are purchasing the debt with a political commitment of the Parliament, Council and Commission to amortize or pay back this debt. And if there are no resources, the states will be paying for it. There has been no issue regarding this up till now. There has been full credibility of the markets up till now. Sorry for interrupting the discussion, but I couldn't resist commenting. And there's some young people that look at us as, what are you saying? So what is your question? Well, we talked about the effect of this on Europe, but I would like to know what's the effect on Africa. What things? Well, the economic consequences of the Ukraine war. Well, and you said that was an easy question? Well, let's go on to a second question. Thank you. Maybe I'm going to not be so aligned with what the speaker is saying or the subject itself, but in this context of financial difficulties, from the standpoint of an economist and the analysis of an economist, could you share the interest of the EU in closing or in having a powerful agreement with partners like Latin America? And what are the advantages of these agreements? What are the difficulties? And if the reserves of some member states to progress in these ambitious trade agreements are really are based on economic considerations or political considerations. And there's someone in the middle of the room that also raised his hand. I think it was Guillaume, if I'm not wrong.
For this very complete presentation, I found it a little bit too optimistic. I have the impression that the car industry, the German car industry, is about to explode in the next future because they are too late in EV and so on. We have heard this morning that we should invest much more to help the global south for climate adaptation and so on. We should also invest much more for global gateway to help southern countries and so on. We have to invest much more in our defense spending with the war and so on. We are totally backward for all high-tech industries, and we have to invest a lot if we want to have a future in that area. We have a climate policy that is totally different from the US one, and we have more problem now with high carbon price and so on. How is it possible that I'm not sure that it's economically difficult, but politically, can we invest so much in so many fields in the next future at European level? If we do that at national level, some country could do something, but it will not be enough and not be coordinated enough to be efficient. Can we do that at European level? We have, the question has been raised before. We have not been able to make next generation EU one more time with the war in Ukraine. I don't see any possibility that we are able in the next future to invest enough to save the European economy.
Yo quería hacerle un par de preguntas. Primero,
I do have a couple of questions for you. First of all, we're talking about GDP and economic growth, but I'm worried about the Gini coefficient in Spain. Is it better or worse? Up till now, there was a high level of imbalance. And up to what point can we have a single currency and 27 different economic policies? Is it possible to maintain this on the long term? We're really sorry, but this gentleman is not using the microphone. We ask him to please use the microphone. Thank you. Well, they are all very difficult questions.
Empezando por África.
Starting with Africa. The impact from the start of the war on energy and food prices has had, of course, an impact on Africa. The demographic structure of most of the continent with very numerous young generations offers additional risks to inflation, and of course there's also political risks. In fact, the last time we ended up with the Arab Spring that didn't end as some expected at the time. And the agreements in which the High Representative is involved to facilitate the export of grain from Ukraine is in fact to try and make the situation in Africa better. If the effects of the war are negative in Europe because of the proximity and also on security and defense issues, this scenario in Africa is even worse. On the one hand, proximity is similar in some cases because dependency is greater, and because the structures to maintain incomes and standards are weaker, and there are places where political and institutional structures are not that robust, and therefore any compensation income policy will have weak channels for its implementation. And I'm not an expert on Africa. I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but the scenario, I believe, is significantly worse than what we're going through in Europe. Pepe, is there anything you would like to say regarding this? I agree with you globally. The perception and the chained information that we receive and that we try to filter in the most intellectually rigorous manner possible makes us feel concerned, no doubt. Hunger. Reasonable demographic growth, exodus, internal and external, lack of water resources, increase of the desert surface, reasonable government attitudes that tend not to leave aside the fossil fuels that they found in their territories, and a debt and degrowth situation. And we also have the economic power of China, India, and powers that contribute credits for the creation of necessary infrastructures that have to be paid back, which means some kind of subordination in the management of those infrastructures built, which means that the continent has to be a place that we put more care on, because we are countries that have inherited the powers of last centuries that were there as colonizers. Thank you.
Acuerdos.
Trade agreements.
Y podemos ponerlos también en
Trade agreements can be seen in parallel to the discussions on strategic autonomy in the Union, or the reduction of dependency on some critical raw materials in some unstable countries, not very unstable, and I'm not speaking about Latin America here. There should be a new balance that still hasn't been defined, at least that's the way in which I see it. Through decades, the EU has been in favor of a free international trade. It has defended it, and with the experience of having a better single market at the Union, and in general terms, I believe that trade agreements are positive in general terms, fundamentally because trade is like technical innovation in economies. Or said in other words, if we believe that in our societies trade is an asset, and all or most of us want to live in countries with market economies, and socialists with a social market economy, then we shouldn't question this basic functioning of the market with the independence of the discussions on its governance. There's different views, and as a socialist you can imagine my view. But working in this scenario, we believe that trade in our country generates growth. Broadening this trade just would generate more growth. What's also true is that sometimes we don't have defined redistribution structures, because as we have the different units, there's no redistribution channels. There are environmental problems, in some cases very severe. There are also problems in the definition of the level of fair competition when regulatory frameworks are very different, and so on. So clearly, trade agreements generate, in general terms, challenges or that should be addressed, and on many occasions they were outside the negotiation framework, because it was considered that facilitating trade was sufficiently good to avoid discussions on environmental effects, labor effects, or gender effects that are also part of the conversations nowadays. In any case, these debates that we've had for some time in Europe are now happening when we're also trying to debate the improvement of regional autonomy. That means reducing our dependency from others, and that is manufacturing locally things that we purchased abroad before. And there have been examples of problems in security from the pandemic till now that justify this movement. And a part of this discussion is also linked to the storage of raw materials, and how the EU's strategy or the Commission's strategy nowadays is in the right track, or will have the successes that are expected. And let me explain myself. There are different legislative initiatives to facilitate or accelerate the local exploit of some raw materials. But the implementation, I believe, is going to generate many problems. So I don't know up to what point, because no one wants to have a mine nearby. So I don't know up to what point having legal targets of local production when the implementation will be very difficult. I don't know if it really is the best strategy to improve the storing of these raw materials, or maybe we could work in other ways. But these other alternatives also question, once again, the trade strategies that have been put in place. There are some agreements, and now I'm going to be more specific, that will be approved. We have, for example, the one in Mercosur that we are working on, and there are environmental issues to be dealt with here. There are also specific and legitimate interests. Of some of the sectors and states, and in the absence of redistribution channels, there are also discussions regarding security. So what is left for Mercosur, or what will happen with this agreement, is quite uncertain. But in a commercial policy or trade policy, and the strategic autonomy and the reduction of the dependency on third countries and climate change are 4 or 5 elements of the geopolitical, political and economic debate that somehow is reshaping the union. I don't know what the result of this reshaping will be, but clearly we've left behind the unlimited trade on trade agreements and globalization, and we are now in a scenario that will see in the future what the final destination is. And this is also linked to what Guillaume was saying, the structural change of the European economy.
Where you say that the challenges are are incredible, and we have to reform our industrial sector, the dependency, the autonomy strategy, the global warming agenda, the New Green Deal. So it's true that the objectives are much bigger than the resources that we have to face them. In any case, I try always to be in the optimist side of the debate, because I remember the debate 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the debate around the euro, for example. Many American economists say the euro will die in 5 years, in 10 years. That's impossible, that the eurozone works without a fiscal pillar. And it's true that in the medium term, we will need a fiscal instrument to manage the cycle. Not only the cycle, but to face the challenges that the Europe has. But at the end of the day, the euro remains here, or I don't know, in the financial crisis, we have the same debates. We are making the incorrect decisions or many mistakes to manage the financial crisis. We didn't have any European banking union, for example, any European banking regulation, and other elements in the debate. But at the end of the day, what we learned from the past is, okay, we suffered many crises from the beginning of the union, but we survived in all of them. So it's true that if we want to talk on the difficulties, or if we want to talk on the problems or the inconvenience for the future of the union, that's clear that all of them are there, as you said. And it's true that we never solve the problems completely. We try to solve some problems, we create another ones with a solution that we put in place, but I try to be optimistic. But I fully agree with you that the challenges are much bigger than the resources that we have. And there is one element that you put on the table that I need to recover, because it's true that or in other words, the trade-off between the single market and the public investments. As you said, what we have seen from the COVID crisis, and even more during the Ukraine or from the start of the war, is national governments, states try to put public money on their companies. We don't have, or we reduce the force of our competition regulation. The single market started to suffer with all of these measures, but the solution is, of course, the solution is clear, but the political room to improve this solution is not easy, because we need more European resources to face these challenges. We don't have money there. If we left member states put their money, we reduce the coherence of the single market. And the trade-off, this trade-off is there, and we need to think and to find European ways to look for a solution of these problems. And
finally, and going back to what I was just saying, having these different tax systems makes things difficult. That's not sustainable, obviously, and that's what I said at the beginning of my talk, that I am more concerned about the evolution of the discussion on own resources and the creation on an instrument that could help us regulate cycles than not the fiscal norms that have to be applied. We cannot have a convergence of policies with no common social and own resources policy, so that the least favored classes can be equal, can have access to the same things. Yes, I fully agree with what you're saying. And I'm just explaining what we are doing and what are the elements that allow us to be optimists. Because of the OECD agreements, we will set a minimum company tax in all member states, depending on the invoicing levels, so that there is a threshold. And we have a European debt, which is the next generation to solve many or some of the problems. We have a debate because having European taxes is a debate that is not exactly the same thing. In the US, each state has very different kind of taxes, except for the company tax, but they also have federal taxes and a federal budget that allows to manage these cycles. Even a federal tax that doesn't cover public policies, because as we know, the US doesn't have the social cohesion vocation that we have in Europe, and this is part of the policy of EU member states that are spending this money. So harmonizing the company tax will be a big effort. We are trying to progress in own resources to continue with next generation. The minimum wage European framework that was approved in this political term is also useful. So I agree with you, but I also want to highlight the progress being made in Europe. But yes, I fully agree with you.
El índice Gini en este último año, al menos en España, se había.
This recent year, at least in Spain, things haven't got worse, but European societies are seeing over the recent decades increases in inequality levels. With the permission of our speaker, who I think we've been using and abusing for far too long now, and so as not to go too far beyond, maybe we can close here by saying thanks to Jonas. Sorry, we don't have any sound. We don't know what this gentleman's saying.